everyone. So today we'll talk about React. So if you have any experience, working or building with React, you must have at some point of time, have used something like Bun Run Dev or npm Run Dev or something. And as soon as you type this thing, what happens is you get a local host link, and upon clicking that link your application starts running in the local environment of your computer, right? And React immediately renders the UI on the browser. So have you ever thought what actually happens? Like React is nowhere using like letting us use or write in the syntax of document.create, document.add element, nothing like that. We just create functional components, and React just brings them together and shows it upon the screen. So have you ever wondered how is React doing all these things? How what is actually happening behind the scenes? And if you have noticed, React is pretty fast, which is why it is widely accepted as the front end language. There are many alternatives also, Angular, Vue.js, and etc. But React is more popular. So and why is it popular? Because it's pretty fast. So how is it fast? And what do we mean by rendering, committing, triggering, or what happens when a state change occurs? Or and sometimes the dom does not even updates even on a re-render. So why does that thing happen? And what is browser painting and all of that? So we'll try to cover all these topics, and we'll try to have a conversation on these topics, and we'll see like how is React actually working behind the scenes. Okay, so let's just see. So let's assume this example where we have a user, and he comes to our let's suppose we have a restaurant, okay? And we have a user or any customer, and they come to our restaurant. Now as soon as they come, they order something. So okay, so maybe they order something, okay? User orders, okay? So just a second. So user orders something. Now what actually happens? So so you can think of this like this restaurant is your website, and this user is any user on the internet, and he orders, which means he wants to see the contents of the application. So now what is the role of React, and how will React serve this request? How would it bring together all the components? How would it show them upon the browser? So what happens is whenever user comes to the restaurant and orders something, what happens is there is a three-step process. First step is trigger, then a render occurs, and finally a commit occurs. What do we mean by trigger? Trigger is basically, for example, think of React as the waiter. Let me just type it over here. React is the waiter over here. Why is that doesn't work? Yeah. So yeah. So React is waiter. I am the user, and I order, and I give my order to React. Like, please show me the website, or bring me some XYZ kind of food to me. Okay. So what React does is it takes our order and goes into the kitchen, which is component kitchen. This image has been taken from the official React documentation, which is a great source of learning React, and I love their documentation, and I have read it a couple of times, and I really love it. So this image is taken from there, and yeah. So what happens is React takes our order, React takes the order from the customer, and then it goes into the component kitchen, and it presents the list of order, whatever user has ordered. Then during the render phase, like the what component kitchen brings together all the ingredients, cooks the food and all of that, and then gives to React. And finally, in the commit phase, React gives the order to the customer. So this is, if we talk in the layman terms and in the layman language, this is a high level overview of what actually happens when any user comes to our website and if we are using React. So user would come to our restaurant, they would order something. React would take their order and bring it to the component kitchen, the which is the triggering phase. Then during the then in the render phase, component kitchen would take all the recipes, important recipes, cook the food, and then give it to React. And finally, in the commit phase, React presents the order to the customer. So this is a high level overview. Now we'll talk about each of these steps in detail and we'll see what is happening. Okay. So first step is trigger phase. So what is triggering? Triggering is basically which means triggering basically means where React says like I need to the user is requesting components and I have to show them. So React basically creates an alert, or maybe React tells that the components have to be rendered now because user is requesting them. So in what cases user would request them, or in what cases a trigger would occur? It is not import it is not necessary that every time user will request them. For sometimes internal changes also might cause a trigger, which so this triggering thing would happen in two cases. Which first is the initial render, when initially the first time user comes to our website, then the trigger happens, which means React says, oh, the user has come, I need to show the components, I need to serve them the components and all, the website. Okay, so in that case a trigger happens. And the second trigger happens when any component or any of its ancestors have encountered any kind of state change. For example, if we had a button over here which was count button, and on clicking, it was initially maybe one, and on clicking this button, it would change to two and change to three and all of that. So when this change occurs, so this is a state change, right? Initially the state was one, then two, then three. So these state changes also trigger a render, and when initially user comes to the website, then an initial trigger or initial render is required. So these two cases are where a trigger is happening. A trigger would happen in our website, which would require which would require React to handle it. So so let's just try to dive deeper into the initial rendering phase. So how is app initially rendered? Like for example, if I come to this website, xcalidraw.com. So how is it initially rendering? So like see, so many frameworks and web packs have come nowadays, so they try to hide the main or the crude logic behind the web applications or the UI part. But the initial logic would not change no matter how many types or number of frameworks we use. So to initially render an app, as soon as a user comes to our website to send a trigger to the components, how does React handle that? It is basically, if you have worked in any kind of project, you would have something called index.js or main.js or app main.js. It is most commonly app.js basically contains your app component. So in the main.js or like over here it is index.js, what happens is for the initial rendering phase, to trigger the initial render phase, uh, React uses this create root from the React DOM client, and it creates a DOM element, DOM target node or DOM node named as. It is the first, like see, the React sees itself and the application as a tree. So initially, to render the app or to show the app, it must have a root node, right? And then it would have children and then subtrees and all of that. So first of all, it creates the root node, and then it calls the render method or render function upon this root element. Okay. So in this way, React triggers an initial render and it tells the application like be ready now, we have to render it, and it go and then further the rendering and committing phase, different kind of thing happens. So this is the initial trigger phase where whenever user comes and initial render has to take place. So to trigger that thing, we have this code and this method which React uses. Okay. So it binds the target DOM node, which is this, and then it calls the render method upon it. So this is some kind of, the UI tree, how React sees our application. You should know that React does not, see our application like in some other way. It actually sees our application as a tree kind of thing. Okay. So now the initial trigger has occurred. Now what would happen? Now what did we discuss? Another trigger would happen in any kind of state changes, right? So as I told you, if I had a button or something, and so maybe if I have a yeah, so if I have a button over here which is counter, and I on clicking it, the state changes to, it gets incremented again and again. So every time it will get incremented. So every time it will get incremented, the state would change, right? And every time state changes, we would have a trigger, okay, which would signal for a re-render. Basically, what is the role of trigger? Trigger basically signals for a re-render. Like, oh my god, somebody has come to our application for the first time. Trigger. And then uh, uh, perform the initial render. And now if the state has changed, again a trigger and re-render the application to display the changes which have occurred in the state. So this happens. So this is the second part where trigger would occur. So once we have initially rendered our application, we can re-render it as many times as we want by state changes or any kind of side effects. And anytime a state change occurs, React automatically schedules a re-render through a trigger first of all. So first it triggers and then it re-renders. Okay. So triggering is the first phase. Okay. Don't forget that. Because how can React render anything if it has not been signaled right now? It would not have dreams, right? Oh, right now I should render or right now I should not render. Every time it gets a signal, it re-renders. And that signal is what called as a trigger. Okay. So this is what, like for example, React is the waiter, okay, and it provided a card, any card X maybe, okay, and the customer said, oh no, I wanted a card Y, okay. So this is the customer wants a state change, right? So React would again go to the component kitchen. Again, component kitchen would do all their stuff, building and whatever, and then they would again give it to React, and React would again render the thing, and then all that thing would again happen. Okay. So yeah, so this was about the triggering phase, which is the initial phase, which is the first step, right? So now okay, so now triggering has been done. Now we'll talk about rendering thing. Rendering is the most important part, which and it has so many concepts inside it. Rendering has reconciliation or algorithm inside it. It has diffing algorithm inside it, and this also explains how is React so fast. And there are also we had okay, so that is it has also has concepts of virtual DOMs, actual DOM APIs, and all of that. So rendering is something which is really, really, really important in React. And now we'll talk about how rendering happens and what actually is rendering. We have been talking about rendering for so long, but what is the meaning of rendering in React? Okay, so let's just see. Once we trigger a render, so whenever I have, for example, I have this button and it has 1 as its current value, and I click on it. Upon clicking, a trigger has been made through React by React, and now a rendering has to be done. So what actually is rendering? So what happens is whenever we trigger a render, React calls the component to figure out what to render. So maybe this was the component. Maybe it was a component XYZ. Okay, so maybe XYZ. Okay, which has this button over here. Now, initially it was 1, so now user clicked it, so it has to become 2, right? So to make this 2, React has to call this component and see its state. What was its previous state, what state it has to change to now, and what all does any HTML or JS, the XML or anything like that would also change, or just this value, the content, the inner HTML. And so to do all that, React has to render this component, like, right? So which means rendering basically means calling the component. So rendering is nothing but just calling the component. We are trying to call this component and we are trying to see, like, okay, so if it has been clicked, so what actually has to happen? So React would call this component. It would see the previous state of this button. React would update the state, and then it would just serve the component. Okay. So the rendering also happens in two in different phases. One is an initial render, and then the second render is during any kind of state changes. Okay, so what do we mean by initial render and what happens in the initial rendering phase? So whenever we call the root component, see over here we had, right, the root dot render thing, right? See over here we have root dot render. So what does this do exactly? See over here, whenever we have an initial render, okay, so once we call once an initial render has to happen, React would call the root component, right? So React would call the root component so that it has something to display. Okay, so upon and once React has called the root component, it will build a virtual DOM. So what do we mean by a virtual DOM? So see, the secret behind why React is so fast lies into this thing, the virtual DOM. So what happens is, when we have an actual DOM, okay, so this is the actual DOM and this is the virtual DOM. Virtual DOM is created by React. This is virtual DOM and this is, actual DOM. Okay. So this virtual DOM is created by React, and this allows React to, you know, very efficiently compare the component elements, and so it allows React to efficiently compare the component elements during each re-render and show only those components which have been updated. uh, I'll explain this more deeper. But first, let's just see what happens during the initial render. What is the role of virtual DOM during the initial render? So when an initial render happens, React builds the virtual DOM. See, if we have this example of code, right? So virtual DOM is nothing but just the representation of the components and their elements in the form of a tree by React. Okay, and this is the virtual DOM, right? And when has this been built? During the initial render phase. Okay, so see, if we have this code snippet, right? So this we have this component clock. It is inside the root component, right? So first, the root component was built, then After that, during and this is all happening in the initial rendering phase. Okay, so React built the root component first, then it saw that okay, the root component contains another element which is known as clock component. So it built clock inside it. So root is right now the parent of clock. And then it saw that clock further has current time. And then React saw that clock component further has more JSX elements inside of it, which are, for example, H1 tag, button element, H2 again, an H1 and an input thing. Okay, so what these are all the children of React, and they are siblings with each other. Okay, and so clock would have all these children, so it would so it draw so it do it in this format. And these all have parent clock, and also the grandparent is root. Okay, and these all are children, and they all are siblings with each other. So this was created during the initial rendering phase. Okay, so this is what happens in the initial render phase. React just calls the root component, and then with the root component, all the components inside the root would also come with along with it. So like this would not happen, right? Root would say, no, I am going. So this would not happen, right? Root would take along all the components which are inside it. It would never leave its children, right? So if it has so it came along with its children. And since it came along with its children, so React knew, okay, all these are children and these are siblings and all of that. And so accordingly, React drew the UI tree, or it can be also known as the virtual. Okay? So this happens during the initial rendering phase. Now we have the concepts of re-renders, right? So when does re-render happen? Re-render happens when any kind of state change occurs, which means if any kind of, for example, again, if we take a button example, and I'm taking this again and again because it's easier to understand. Okay, so if it's there, we have a button, and again it is clicked, and then its state has changed from 1 to 2. So to show this change upon the website, we have to uh, trigger a re-render. Like we have to update this UI tree. See, currently this UI tree has this button component, right? So it currently has one value inside it. Now the state has changed, so we have to update this UI. How do we update it? So to update, see the just told you, right? The UI tree building happens during the render phase. So till the time we are not rendering the application again, this UI tree would not change, right? So to change the UI tree and to update the DOM tree, the virtual DOM, and then following it, the actual DOM, we have to trigger a re-render. Now what happens is, uh, this also explains why is React so fast. If I can copy this thing over here. Uh, uh, oh my god, can I erase this? Yeah, yeah, okay. Sometimes I try to erase this and it just removes everything. And see this now. Okay, so now we'll see what happens during a state change. How React updates the DOM. Okay. So, okay. See, consider this button over here, right? See, we have this button over here. Okay. It currently has one value. I click this button and it has to change from 1 to 2. So how would this happen? See, one thing was uh, we have to update the DOM element, right? Now to update this DOM tree, one thing is we destroy the complete tree and rebuild the whole thing. But it would take too much time. We have some general algorithms known as state algorithms. So how much is it visible? Okay. So this thing, so to do this thing, we have many kinds of algorithms. Some general algorithms are known as state algorithms, and they have a time complexity of O of NQ. So, for example, if just consider if we have 1,000 elements and we have to completely destroy the tree and rebuild, or maybe redesign and again build the tree, so it would take 1,000 raised to the power 3 times, which is in billions or millions, like that. So how does React achieve this? See, if React would not have solved this problem, then there was no use of building React, right? So React uses another algorithm which is known as diffing algorithm, or reconciliation algorithm, and it does the same thing in O of n time complexity, which is a huge, huge, huge reduction from NQ to O of n. So see, this is like, I'm not trying to tell you about diffing algorithm, because this is a whole concept in itself, and it is it cannot be told in this manner. So I'll just try to give you a little bit overview what actually happens during a state change, and how does rendering is happening during that phase. Okay. uh, so see, over here, if button, see over here, we have the state, right? And the state is changed. Okay. So now you tell me what all things would change right now. See, only the inner HTML of this button would change, right? If only the inner HTML of this button is changing, so why do I destroy all these things, all these elements, and rebuild them if they are just completely the same? Right? So it doesn't make sense to waste our time and all of that, and increase the expense of application. So what React does is, as soon as a re-render is triggered, React basically tries to differentiate. It compares. See, it would just again build this, like it would just have this, and it would just see, okay, so this is also clock, this is also h1 and something, this is 2 right now, because state has changed, then it is same and it is same. Now it would compare, okay, these two same, no need, so these two say same, okay, so this has changed, okay, and then these two say, these two say. So it what it notices it is that this and this has changed. So it would note this, okay. So it has found the difference between these two DOM, these are virtual DOMs, okay, these two DOMs, and it has seen what all elements have changed. Now React would take note of these, and then just update these elements in the actual DOM, and rest all the elements would remain the same in the actual. Okay. So this is a bit overview of the diffing algorithm. Uh, uh, right. So it is a whole concept on its own, and React has a very, very, very good article upon this. If you type reconciliation algorithm on the Google search bar, it would give you the React documentation, and you can read over there. It's pretty cool thing. Okay, so this is a high level overview, and this is what makes React actually really fast. Like, oh, end time complexity is commendable. Like, crazy thing it is. Okay, so this is how this is what happens during a re-render phase, or whenever a state change is happening. So how is the DOM getting updated? The actual DOM is getting updated. So the so React just compares its virtual DOM and see which elements have changed, and it takes the node of those elements, and then in the actual DOM only changes those elements. Okay, so this was about rendering. So we saw what happens during the initial render where the virtual DOM is built, and then how the state change is handled during a re-render phase, and what is all about virtual DOM and all of this. Okay, so this is why React is so fast. And okay. Also, this is the reason that sometimes, even after a re-render has occurred, the DOM remains completely same. Because, for example, maybe state has changed because of, for example, if we had a, over here we had a variable of for data, and we would have just fetched the data and stored it in the variable. So none of these elements would get changed in that case, so the DOM was completely safe. So this is why it happens. So this is the theory behind it. Okay. So after rendering, so first triggering has happened. It has two phases: initial trigger and then the trigger upon the state change. Then rendering will happen. Rendering also has two phases: the initial phase and the state change re-render phase. Now step 3 is just committing. What is committing? Where React actually commits the components to the actual DOM, which uh, like from the virtual DOM, it just shifts everything to the actual DOM, and it tells the and then it tells the browser like, okay, so this is your DOM right now, and just paint the browser with this thing. Okay, so this also happens in two phases. During the initial phase, it uses an append child DOM API to initially commit the uh, uh, the DOM upon the browser, and then in the following re-renders, it just makes the minimal comparisons uh, with the help of diffing algorithm, and then commits the components to the actual. Okay, so this is all about. So this is how React is actually working behind the scenes. So this much work is being done by React, and it is making our lives so much easier. And yeah, React is just great. And like, this is just the epilogue where browser painting happens. Like when React submits the actual DOM, what happens is browser then just repaints the user screen. Where this is also known as browser rendering, but often people say it as browser painting because rendering might cause confusion. So this is what React. This is the actual DOM given by React to browser and then browser just paints it upon the user screen. uh okay, so this is what actually happens in the high overview. Or maybe, so if anybody asks you like, how is React so fast, what is actually happening, what happens what happens in the triggering phase, rendering phase, committing phase, what are these phases and all, so I think you should be able to explain all of that. So yeah, so this was all about that. So thank you everyone.